Did you know that the CIA were plotting to assassinate Julian Assange? In 2017, officials at the highest levels of the US government were plotting his demise. And this wasn't just an idea. Specific plans were suggested, diagrammed, and ran through various committees before they reached the top. The scheme was even given the green light by top officials, with months of planning going into the hit. Which begs the question, why was the CIA and multiple other secret intelligence agencies wanting to kill Assange so much that they were willing to break international law in broad daylight? And how did such an unhinged plan get so far in the first place? Well, to understand the true story, we need to understand why they wanted Julian Assange dead so badly. It all began in 1999, when Julian Assange had an idea. Over history, there have been countless schemes of corruption and crimes that never got reported. It was just too risky for the people who knew to leak the information. And today, it's no different. In the US, leaked info can't be used in court if it has been obtained illegally, making even the act of speaking entirely pointless as far as justice is concerned. And this status quo exists to protect those in power, meaning it was unlikely to see any real institutional change. But what if an organization could do the leaking for the whistleblower whilst keeping their identity anonymous? People had been sending news agencies anonymous packages for years, but Assange was going to streamline this process. All sources would remain anonymous where possible, and they could contact WikiLeaks from around the globe. Anyone, anywhere could speak up about crimes and corruption, completely going against the established media and governments around the world. And the best part about this was that it got around the legal system as well, because the documents published by WikiLeaks weren't illegally obtained by WikiLeaks themselves, and were therefore admissible as evidence. And this was the idea that Julian Assange had in 1999, but it would be years before this finally came to fruition.
WikiLeaks! WikiLeaks! WikiLeaks!
However, by 2006, everything was ready. Assange had worked with friends in Iceland to launch the site, making it public around the world. At first, the site wasn't getting much attention, but all of this would change incredibly soon. The very first leaks came as a dribble. A far-right membership list here, a paper trail leading to financial corruption there, but nothing that would stay in the front pages for very long, if at all. Which is why for the first year, WikiLeaks just flew under the radar. But that all changed when WikiLeaks made the brave choice of leaking US government documents. In November of 2007, Assange and WikiLeaks released a document entitled Standard Operating Procedures, which sounds boring until you look at where it's from: Guantanamo Bay, the infamous shadowy prison that has been in the news for many years after allegations of waterboarding, isolation, and other torture methods came out. And WikiLeaks had all but confirmed people's worst fears about Guantanamo Bay. The manual included details on keeping new prisoners in isolation for 2 weeks to soften them up, and an extensive system for deciding which prisoners were allowed basic medical assistance. And this leak began a long and drawn-out hunt for Assange that's still going on today. Even though WikiLeaks would easily continue without them, Assange was the figurehead behind the site, and the US government had the main enemy in sight. The prospect of WikiLeaks was terrifying to corrupt people in powerful positions. Accountability is hard to find for these sorts of people and organizations, but WikiLeaks promised that everyone could be found out, and at first the US was both powerless and unwilling to do something. They could easily pursue the actual whistleblowers using the Espionage Act, but Assange was protected by international laws. However, many people in the government wanted revenge. People like Hillary Clinton. They wanted Assange behind bars, but they were outnumbered by people who weren't affected. But eventually this position became less and less popular in government, as Assange would go on to publish more and more leaks. And 2 years later, WikiLeaks published nearly 600,000 messages sent by US officials during 9/11. They exposed how the event was used to drum up support for both the war on terror and the grossly authoritarian Patriot Act. But still, this wasn't enough to sway lots of members of government. People still cared about the First Amendment, and taking care of Assange would require breaking too many legal rules. And there were bigger, larger questions about freedom of the press. Assange was tiptoeing the line between dissident and journalist, making his arrest a slippery slope to state-controlled media. But the US weren't making it easy for themselves. There were just too many dark secrets getting leaked. In 2010, WikiLeaks published more info about the war in Iraq, including a video showing a US helicopter gunning down civilians and a reporter. The worldwide outrage was palpable, and the US hit a new low in public perception. And it only got so much worse when WikiLeaks published thousands of pages of documents exposing the US's war on terror. The final straw came when WikiLeaks supported Edward Snowden, helping him escape from US authorities to Russia, and even having people stay with him for months after he arrived. Because just being associated with Snowden put WikiLeaks on the US's radar. Adding the massive leaks to this, and Assange had a recipe for resentment by the CIA. Until this point, the Obama government hadn't paid much attention to WikiLeaks itself, treating the actual leaks as separate problems. But after Snowden, that all changed. It was open season on WikiLeaks, and the government granted the FBI unrestricted access to warrants and subpoenas for anything related to the website. In fact, they built a file on WikiLeaks and Assange based on conversations with friendly spy networks. The CIA established a separate team called the WikiLeaks team. Their job was to try and find evidence of links between WikiLeaks WikiLeaks and hostile foreign powers. There was even pressure made to redefine Assange as an information broker rather than a journalist, a necessary step on the path to prosecution. But the Obama government wasn't about to breach freedom of the press just yet. However, the pressure was mounting, and every new leak and every new embarrassment for the US government led to more pressure on WikiLeaks. During WikiLeaks' early days, Assange was free to travel the world, working on leads for WikiLeaks and building his career. He even won awards in journalism, including the Amnesty International UK Media Award and the Economist Award. But in 2010, this high-flying life all came crashing down when Swedish officials released an arrest warrant accusing Assange of grave sexual crimes, which was a strange and random accusation. He was then arrested but later broke bail, putting in a request for asylum in Ecuador. But he didn't have a way to get there, forcing Assange onto the doorstep of the Ecuadorian embassy in London, where they would welcome him and he would live for the rest of his life, stuck in a small room with a computer, a bed, and that was pretty much it. Inside this embassy, Assange was untouchable by authorities from any other country, and with his computer and an internet connection, he could continue working. Although Assange was now in purgatory, with the British police waiting outside 24/7 if he tried to leave. The only thing he could do was to continue WikiLeaks, and this infuriated the US government. While he was in British custody, there was a chance they could snag him with an extradition request, but now their options were severely limited. There was absolutely no legal way to get Assange anymore, and he could just carry on publishing leaks. So during the next few years, debates within the US government raged on about whether WikiLeaks was indictable under the Espionage Act. Even though in 2013 the Obama government had prohibited it, lots of factions within different government agencies wanted his head. And then WikiLeaks finally gave the left wing of the government a reason to hate him as well, as in 2016, WikiLeaks published leaked messages which implicated the Democrats in a scheme to handicap Bernie Sanders' nomination bid. US intelligence decided that the leak had come from a Russian hack, and so getting Assange was now deemed a bipartisan issue, and the pressure to do something about him only grew. And then after Trump won the presidency, partially thanks to this leak, and WikiLeaks destroying his opponent Hillary Clinton, you would only expect him to go easy on Assange. He even said, quote, "I love WikiLeaks" during the campaign.
WikiLeaks! I love WikiLeaks!
But once he was in office, Trump feigned ignorance, saying it wasn't his thing.
I know nothing about WikiLeaks. It's not my thing.
This was all a political move. The rest of Trump's government hated WikiLeaks and Assange, so he had to distance himself. Plus, he was about to install Mike Pompeo as the new CIA director, and nobody hated Assange more than he did, which became evident in early 2017, when Mike Pompeo took the stand in Washington to give his first speech as director. And instead of talking about the future or his plans for the CIA in general, he focused on WikiLeaks.
WikiLeaks walks like a hostile intelligence service and talks like a hostile intelligence service.
In his first chance to speak publicly in his new position of power, Pompeo chose to call WikiLeaks a non-state hostile intelligence service, often abetted by state actors like Russia. But why did the US and CIA pivot so quickly from their earlier decision to consider Assange a journalist? Well, WikiLeaks had published the most embarrassing leak to date. In early 2017, WikiLeaks published a treasure trove of documents and code called Vault 7, taken directly from the CIA's most secure databases. According to WikiLeaks, the vault contained malware, viruses, trojans, weaponized zero-day exploits, malware remote control systems, and associated documentation. This was an international embarrassment for the CIA, seeing their specific hacking unit get hacked themselves. And so this began stage 2 of the process, kidnapping Assange. But before we continue, I'd like to thank today's sponsor, Babbel. You see, I've been living in Mexico for a while now, and when I arrived, I had no idea how to speak Spanish. So here's what I did. I downloaded an app called Babbel, one of the top language learning apps in the world, and I chose Spanish as the language that I wanted to learn. And just within a few minutes, I learned some simple Spanish phrases like me llamo, de donde eres, and me puedes dar. And by learning Spanish, it really helped me to explore Latin American culture and connect with locals. By using Babbel, I was able to learn how to have real-world conversations in Spanish, with their lessons preparing me to have practical conversations about travel, business, relationships, and more. In fact, Babbel is scientifically proven to help you start speaking a new language in just 3 weeks, with their lessons being designed by real language teachers, making Babbel the best language app out there. And they even have a 20-day money-back guarantee. That way you can start learning and see how far you get before committing. So what language would you like to learn? Whatever the language is, you can start learning today with an extra 60% off of your subscription by using my link in the description below. And thanks to Babbel for sponsoring this video. For the CIA, Assange became a top priority. Updates on WikiLeaks were regularly sent to Trump, and intelligence officials begged for a chance to get to crack him. And all of this was encouraged and incited by Mike Pompeo, who still talked about WikiLeaks and Assange at every opportunity possible. Mounting pressure to redefine WikiLeaks eventually worked for the CIA after the Trump administration complied with their demands. And in a conversation with CIA agents after a speech on WikiLeaks, Pompeo told them to figure out a solution and reportedly said, "Nothing's off limits. Don't self-censor yourself. I need operational ideas from you. I'll worry about the lawyers in Washington." And this this was exactly what they would do. By mid-2017, the CIA were finding success in their race for intelligence on WikiLeaks. They had built up substantial portraits of its members and were working on possible plans of attack. Measures were suggested like sabotaging their web servers, planting false information to cause division, or even stealing their computers. But because of how secure WikiLeaks was in general, all of these plans were thrown in the bin. Instead, the CIA began to work on a much more insidious, dangerous, and ultimately symbolic move: kidnapping or assassinating Julian Assange. Now obviously this was going to be hard. Assange was still holed up in the Ecuadorian embassy in London, as he had been for years. So to get to him, they had to violate 3 countries' sovereignty at once. Now Assange was an Australian citizen. The embassy was in London, but it was technically Ecuadorian soil. But still, Pompeo's reported obsession won through and the CIA began drawing up their plans. First, it was the idea of kidnapping Assange that was at the top level of government meetings. One former agent said a possible plan was to break into the embassy, drag Assange out, and bring him to where we want. Or they could simply hand him over to British authorities, who wanted Assange on bail charges and would possibly send him to the US once they were finished. But these ideas were shot down as ridiculous. The British were involved in talks with the CIA as well, but wouldn't turn a blind eye to letting CIA operatives inside the embassy. Clearly, kidnapping is off the table, but the CIA wanted to go further, and so stage 3 was about to commence: assassination. Yahoo News, who leaked the actual conversations and plan made at the CIA, talked about a meeting in mid-2017 between the president and other top officials. During this meeting, Trump asked the CIA whether they could assassinate Assange and other WikiLeaks members, and prompted them to drop some options and plans. Trump would later deny this accusation, but the fact remains that the plans were made, and there were more discussions on whether assassinating Assange could be made legal as well. His earlier designation as a spy helped, but it was still a stretch. Now it's understandable that the lawyers at the CIA weren't making too many objections. There was a good chance lots of them didn't know what was actually going on, and sources within the CIA say, quote, "When Pompeo took over, he cut the lawyers out a lot of things." And it's unknown whether the CIA's head legal counsel had even heard of the plot whilst it was being drawn up. And so being unburdened by questions about legality, the CIA plowed ahead anyway. Now at the time, Assange was fairly inactive. He'd been stuck in the embassy, completely isolated from the modern world. Although after years of inaction, Assange's personal situation coincidentally began to heat up again at the same time, when Sweden dropped their charges against Assange in May of 2017, citing both a lack of evidence and an inability to prosecute. How much truth the charges had in the first place is still debated, although it was an awfully convenient excuse for the police to pursue him in the first place. And this made escape much more likely, and CIA intelligence indicated a Russian plot to escort Assange out of the embassy, and the memory of Snowden's successful escape must have been fresh in the CIA's minds. And so their operatives ramped up their planning and surveillance of the embassy, as did the British and Russian agents as well. Russian agents even began practicing escape maneuvers in their cars outside, designed to throw off and confuse anyone watching them. One former senior official said, "It got to the point where every human being in a 3-block radius was working for one of the intelligence services, whether they were street sweepers or police officers or security guards." It was clear the Ecuadorian embassy was swamped with government agents. So who was going to get to Assange first? Well, the CIA wasn't going to let anyone else take him. The time to get him was now, and this is when the CIA put their plans to action. One of these involved waiting for the escape attempt and start a gunfight with the Russian agents, hopefully killing or securing Assange in the process. Another involved crashing a car into the same car Assange took, then grabbing him or putting a bullet in his head. If Assange made it to the plane, the British agreed that they could open fire on the tires or fly a helicopter above it, preventing him from taking off. Friendly European countries could also deny their airspace to the plane if it got airborne, forcing it to land. In any event, a plan to stop Assange leaving was made between British and US intelligence operatives, but this was a last-ditch measure. The CIA was still planning a hit, while Assange was still in the embassy, and Assange had made it clear to friends he believed his room was bugged, having all important conversations in a certain room he believed that was safe. WikiLeaks members also made a deal to hold back the worst information they had from Vault 7 leak, promising to only release it in the event of one of their untimely deaths. And they had a very good reason to be paranoid. The CIA had a man on the inside at the Ecuadorian embassy who was giving them all of the intel on Assange's daily life. Plans were also concocted to poison Assange, perhaps using this inside man. But finally, it looked like the CIA's disregard of legality and hatred for Assange was wearing thin at the White House. Legal representatives from other branches of government, including the president's office, had heard wind of the plot. They shut it down, saying that the fact that it was even considered would harm the US's legal case if they ever did finally get him. And that's ignoring the diplomatic consequences of breaking into a foreign embassy on foreign soil to kill or kidnap a foreign national. It was doomed to fail in the end. Plus, the US had other less provocative plans that they were making headway, and this was stage 4. Over time, they had soured the Ecuadorian government's relationship with Assange. This was only made worse when Assange released damaging info about the Ecuadorian president's involvement in a corruption scandal. Ecuador accused Assange of being incredibly hostile and disagreeable, citing problems with his personal hygiene and his mental health, and so they began to restrict his outside visits and his internet access. UN officials who later examined Assange stated he showed signs of, quote, prolonged psychological torture. And then eventually in April of 2019, Ecuador finally gave him up, letting British police arrest and drag him away. And today, Assange is still still in the process of appealing extradition to the US, with his case slowly progressing through multiple courts. Now, the US hasn't won yet, but they're very close. Soon, Assange will be shipped off any day now if the UK courts decide on it, showing that in the end, it was never about stopping WikiLeaks. Instead, it was about revenge for embarrassing the US. Assange was simply a scapegoat, a figure that helped blow the whistle on the devastating corruption and the lurid crimes of the elite. And even though the CIA did conspire to murder him, the US might well get Assange back in their clutches. The motive of revenge still hasn't changed. The US will also want to set an example to any future whistleblowers as well. Dragging a journalist through years of hell just for associating with them has sent a very clear message. And this is especially significant considering that it's even easier to leak data online today than during WikiLeaks' height. And so with governments so determined on punishing whistleblowers and maintaining their ability to spy on their people, the future looks as grim for Assange as it does for the freedom of the press.